The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the parade ground at Fort Meridian as Colonel Marcus Hayes began his weekly inspection ritual. His polished boots clicked against the concrete with military precision, each step echoing like a countdown timer in the crisp October air. 23 years of service had carved deep lines around his steel-gray eyes, and his reputation for finding the smallest infractions was legendary among the ranks. Today felt different, though an electric tension hung in the air that made the hair on the back of his neck stand at attention. Hayes moved down the line of new recruits, like a shark cutting through still water. These fresh faces always amused him with their nervous energy and desperate attempts to appear perfect. Most would wash out within 6 months, unable to handle the psychological pressure of real military life. He paused at Private Johnson, adjusting the young man's collar with sharp, deliberate movements that made the recruit's Adam's apple bob with fear. Regulation states your collar should sit exactly 1 inch from your neck. Private, Hayes growled, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen combat in 3 different theaters. 1 inch. Not 1 1/4. Not 7/8. 1 inch. Yes, sir. Johnson barked, sweat beading on his forehead. Despite the cool morning temperature, Hayes continued his methodical examination, finding fault with a crooked name tag here, a scuffed boot there. Each correction was delivered with the surgical precision of a man who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death in the field. His subordinates often whispered that Hayes could spot a loose thread from 50 yards away. And they weren't entirely wrong. As he approached the end of the line, his gaze fell upon Private Sarah Chun, a slight woman with intelligent dark eyes and an almost unnaturally calm demeanor. Something about her stillness bothered him. While the other recruits practically vibrated with nervous energy, Chun stood like a statue, her breathing controlled and measured. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture textbook perfect. But there was something in her eyes that didn't belong on a fresh recruit's face. It was the look of someone who had seen things, done things that most people couldn't imagine. Hayes stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the small scar that ran along his left temple, a souvenir from Kandahar that he'd never bothered to have surgically corrected. Chun didn't flinch or look away, which was unusual. Most recruits couldn't maintain eye contact with him for more than a few seconds. Name and serial number. Private, he commanded, though he already knew both from her file. Private Sarah Chun. Serial number 84792634. Sir, she replied, her voice steady and clear. Hayes began his inspection, checking her insignia, the alignment of her ribbons, the shine on her boots. Everything was perfect, too perfect, perhaps. As his gaze traveled down her uniform, he noticed something that made his jaw tighten. Just beneath the edge of her left sleeve, barely visible, was the hint of black ink against her skin. Roll up your sleeve, Private Chun, he ordered, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Military Regulation 670-1 clearly states that visible tattoos are prohibited during duty hours. Chun hesitated for just a fraction of a second, so brief that most people would have missed it. But Hayes had spent decades reading micro-expressions and body language. That tiny pause sent a warning signal through his nervous system, though he couldn't yet articulate why. Sir, the tattoo is normally covered by my uniform, Chun replied carefully. I wasn't aware it was visible. I don't care what you were or weren't aware of, Private. I said roll up your sleeve, now. The other recruits watched with the morbid fascination of people witnessing a car accident. They had all heard stories about Colonel Hayes' inspections, but seeing one in person was like watching a master craftsman at work, terrifying and impressive in equal measure. Chun slowly began to roll up her left sleeve, her movements deliberate and controlled. As more of her forearm became visible, Hayes could see the beginning of what appeared to be an intricate design. His initial assumption was that it would be something typical: a name, a date, maybe some inspirational quote that young soldiers often got inked during their first leave. But as Chun continued to roll up the fabric, Hayes felt his world begin to tilt on its axis. The tattoo that emerged was unlike anything he had expected. Coiled around Chun's wrist like a living thing was a black viper, its scales rendered in exquisite detail, its fangs bared in a silent strike. The serpent's eyes were twin points of obsidian that seemed to stare directly at him with malevolent intelligence. But it wasn't just any snake, it was a specific design. One that Hayes recognized with the kind of bone-deep terror that comes from confronting a ghost you thought you had buried forever. The blood drained from his face so quickly that he felt dizzy. His hands, which had remained steady through firefights and mortar attacks, began to tremble uncontrollably. The morning air suddenly felt thin, as if someone had sucked all the oxygen from his lungs. Around him, the sounds of the base distant conversations, vehicle engines, the flutter of flags in the breeze faded to a dull roar. That symbol had died with 12 men in the mountains of Afghanistan 15 years ago. Operation Black Viper had been classified at the highest levels, its very existence denied by everyone from the Pentagon to the White House. Only a handful of people had ever known about it, and Hayes had personally ensured that most of those people would never speak about it again, ever. His right hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, a motion so subtle that the other recruits didn't notice. But Chun's eyes tracked the movement with the precision of a predator watching prey. For the first time since the inspection began, her expression changed. The mask of nervous compliance slipped away, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. "Is there a problem, sir?" Chun asked, her voice now carrying a different quality, less deferential, more challenging. The transformation was so complete that Hayes wondered how he had ever mistaken her for an ordinary recruit. Hayes tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was filled with sand. The black viper seemed to pulse with life on Chun's wrist, its obsidian eyes boring into his soul. Memories he had spent years suppressing came flooding back. The sound of helicopter rotors in the thin mountain air, the smell of cordite and blood, the weight of decisions that had damned his soul but saved his career. "Where?" He finally managed to croak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get that tattoo?" Chun's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. She took a small step closer, close enough that only Hayes could hear her next words. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 15 years of planning, of patience, of carefully orchestrated revenge. "Hello, Uncle Marcus," she whispered, and Hayes felt his world collapse around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. The other recruits continued to stand at attention, unaware that they were witnessing the moment when Colonel Marcus Hayes's carefully constructed life began to unravel. In the distance, a flag snapped in the wind, and somewhere a radio crackled with routine base communications. But for Hayes, the only sound that mattered was the thundering of his own heartbeat as he stared into the eyes of a ghost he thought he had killed long ago. The world around Colonel Hayes seemed to contract to a single point of focus: the black viper tattoo and the woman who wore it like a badge of vengeance. The familiar sounds of Fort Meridian faded into white noise as his mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Uncle Marcus. No one had called him that in 15 years. No one who was still alive. Dismissed. Hayes barked suddenly at the other recruits, his voice cracking slightly on the command. "Return to your barracks immediately. Private Chun, you will remain for additional inspection." The recruits scattered like startled birds, grateful to escape what had clearly become a powder keg situation. Within moments, Hayes and Chun stood alone on the parade ground, the morning sun casting long shadows between them like prison bars. Hayes's hand remained poised near his sidearm, but Chun seemed completely unconcerned by the implied threat. If anything, she appeared to be enjoying his discomfort, watching him with the patient satisfaction of a chess player who had just revealed a devastating strategy. "You're supposed to be dead," Hayes whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "David Chun died in that helicopter crash outside Kabul. I saw the casualty report myself." Chen's smile widened, revealing perfect white teeth that somehow made her expression more predatory rather than friendly. "My father was very good at staying alive when people wanted him dead, Uncle Marcus. It's a skill he passed on to me before your people finally caught up with him." The casual way she mentioned her father's death sent ice through Hayes's veins. David Chun had been his communications specialist during Operation Black Viper, a quiet man with an uncanny ability to intercept enemy transmissions and decode their tactical plans. He had also been one of the few members of the unit who had questioned the mission's true objectives when things began to go sideways. "Your father died in a training accident 3 years ago," Hayes said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded hollow. "I attended his funeral myself." "You attended the funeral of David Chun?" "Yes," she replied, beginning to circle him slowly like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "But that wasn't my father. That was a homeless veteran you had your people dress up and burn beyond recognition." "Very thorough, Uncle Marcus. Very convincing. Except for one small detail." Hayes felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "What detail?" Chum stopped directly in front of him again, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "The dental records you used belonged to a man who had never been to Afghanistan. My father kept very detailed records of his deployments, including his medical files. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that the David Chen who died in that convenient training accident had never set foot outside of Nevada." The implications hit Hayes like a physical blow. If Chun had access to her father's deployment records, she might have access to much more. Operation Black Viper had been compartmentalized, but David Chun had been in communications. He would have heard everything, seen everything, recorded everything. "What do you want?" Hayes asked, abandoning any pretense that this was still a routine inspection. Chun reached into her breast pocket with deliberate slowness, her eyes never leaving his face. Hayes tensed, his hand moving closer to his weapon, but what she withdrew wasn't a gun or a knife. It was a small digital recorder, no bigger than a matchbox. "I want you to listen to something," she said, pressing a button on the device. The sound that emerged from the tiny speaker made Hayes's blood turn to ice water. It was his own voice, younger but unmistakably his, crackling through what sounded like radio static. "Viper base, this is Viper 6. The village is clear of combatants. Repeat, no enemy forces present. We have approximately 30 civilians, mostly women and children." Another voice responded, Colonel Patricia Vance, his commanding officer at the time. "Copy that. Viper 6, rules of engagement remain in effect. No witnesses." Hayes's younger voice came back, hesitant now. "Ma'am, these are non-combatants. They're not armed. I didn't ask for your assessment of their threat level, Colonel. I gave you an order. No witnesses means no witnesses. Execute immediately." The recording continued for another 30 seconds, capturing Hayes's reluctant acknowledgement of the order and the sound of automatic weapons fire in the background. When Chun finally stopped the playback, the silence that followed was deafening. "Recognize that conversation, Uncle Marcus?" Chun asked, her voice now carrying the cold fury of someone who had spent years planning this moment. "My father recorded everything during Operation Black Viper. Every order, every mission briefing, every war crime you and your unit committed in the name of national security." Hayes felt the ground shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. "That recording proves nothing. It could be fabricated, taken out of context. Could it? Chun interrupted, producing a second device, this one larger, with a small screen. What about this? She pressed another button, and the screen flickered to life, showing grainy but unmistakable footage of a mountain village. Hayes watched in horror as his younger self appeared in the frame, directing soldiers as they moved through the settlement. The timestamp in the corner showed a date that officially didn't exist, during an operation that had never happened. My father was very thorough, Chung continued, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone that made her words even more chilling. He documented everything because he knew that someday someone would try to bury the truth. He just didn't expect that someone to be his own commanding officer. Hayes' mind raced through the implications. If David Chun had recorded the village massacre, what else had he captured? The arms deals with local warlords? The execution of prisoners? The systematic elimination of anyone who might expose Operation Black Viper? How many people have you shown this to? Hayes asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Chun tilted her head, considering the question. So far? Just you. But that's about to change very quickly, unless you start giving me some answers. What answers? What do you want to know? I want to know why you killed my father. I want to know why you murdered 12 good soldiers to cover up your war crimes. And I want to know where you buried the evidence that could have saved their families from 15 years of wondering what really happened to their sons and daughters. Hayes felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine. The families of the Black Viper unit had been told their loved ones died in a classified operation, their bodies lost in enemy territory. The truth was far worse. Hayes had ordered their execution when they began asking too many questions about the mission's true objectives. Your father was a security risk, Hayes said, falling back on the justification he had used to rationalize his actions for 15 years. He was going to expose classified operations that were vital to national security. Chen's laugh was like broken glass. National security? Is that what you call selling weapons to Taliban commanders? Is that what you call executing civilians and blaming it on enemy action? My father wasn't a security risk, Uncle Marcus. He was a witness to your crimes, and you couldn't let him live with that knowledge. Hayes realized with growing horror that Chun wasn't just seeking answers, she was building a case. Every question she asked, every piece of evidence she revealed, was part of a larger strategy to expose everything he had spent 15 years trying to hide. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Hayes said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. The people involved in Operation Black Viper, the ones who gave the orders, they're not going to let you walk away from this. Chun's smile returned, colder than before. Who says I'm planning to walk away? As if summoned by her words, Hayes heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching the parade ground. Multiple engines, moving fast. His blood ran cold as he realized that Chun hadn't come alone, and this confrontation was far from over. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, but Chun didn't even glance toward the noise. Her eyes remained fixed on Hayes, with the unwavering focus of a sniper lining up a kill shot. The colonel's hand finally closed around his sidearm, but before he could draw the weapon, Chen moved with fluid precision that spoke of years of combat training. Her left hand shot out, striking his wrist with surgical accuracy at the exact pressure point that would cause his fingers to go numb. His grip on the pistol loosened involuntarily, and Chun's right hand completed the disarmament, twisting his arm behind his back in a move that would have impressed his own drill instructors. Within 3 seconds, Hayes found himself face down on the concrete with his own service weapon pressed against the base of his skull. I wouldn't recommend calling for help, Chun said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather rather than holding a loaded gun to a superior officer's head. I've spent the last 18 months learning everything about your daily routines, your security protocols, and your backup procedures. Those vehicles you're hearing? They're not coming to rescue you. Hayes tried to turn his head, but Chun increased the pressure on his arm, sending lightning bolts of pain through his shoulder. Who are you? He gasped. You're not David Chun's daughter. Sarah Chun died in a car accident when she was 12 years old. Very good, Uncle Marcus. I was wondering when you'd figure that out. Chun's voice carried a note of genuine approval, like a teacher praising a slow student who had finally grasped a difficult concept. Sarah Chun did die 12 years ago, which made her identity perfect for my purposes. A dead girl with no living relatives, no social media presence, no digital footprint that couldn't be carefully reconstructed. The vehicles had stopped somewhere nearby, and Hayes could hear car doors slamming, but no voices calling his name or demanding to know what was happening. The silence was more terrifying than any alarm could have been. My real name is Maria Santos, Chung continued, and I've been hunting the surviving members of Operation Black Viper for the past 5 years. You're number 7 on my list, Uncle Marcus. The other 6 won't be attending any more military reunions. Hayes felt his blood turn to ice as the implications sank in. The accidents, he whispered. Lieutenant Morrison's car crash in Germany. Captain Williams's hiking accident in Colorado. Sergeant Baker's house fire in Texas. Accidents, Maria repeated with mock sympathy. Such a tragic series of coincidences. Although I have to say, Sergeant Baker was the most challenging. He'd become quite paranoid in his retirement, installed all sorts of security systems. It took me 3 months to find a way into his house that wouldn't trigger his alarms. Hayes' mind raced through the list of his former unit members, trying to remember who else might still be alive. Major Rodriguez. You said Captain Rodriguez sent his regards, but Rodriguez was a major when you put a bullet in his head and dumped his body in a ravine outside Kandahar? Maria's voice hardened. Yes, he was a major. He was also my handler when I was working undercover for Army intelligence. Miguel Rodriguez was the closest thing to a father I ever had after my real parents were killed in a cartel bombing in Juarez. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Maria Santos wasn't just seeking revenge for her adoptive father's death. She was a trained intelligence operative with the skills and resources to systematically eliminate an entire military unit. Hayes realized he wasn't dealing with a grieving daughter seeking answers. He was facing a professional killer who had spent years planning his destruction. Rodriguez recruited me when I was 16, Maria continued, her voice taking on a nostalgic quality that made her words even more chilling. Pulled me out of a refugee camp and gave me a purpose. Taught me languages, combat techniques, infiltration methods. I was his best asset until you murdered him for asking too many questions about civilian casualties. Hayes tried to process this information while fighting through the pain in his shoulder. If you're Army intelligence, then you know that Operation Black Viper was sanctioned at the highest levels. We were following orders from Colonel Patricia Vance, who conveniently died in a helicopter crash 6 months after the operation concluded, Maria interrupted. Another tragic accident, I'm sure. Except I've seen the maintenance records for that helicopter, Uncle Marcus. Someone tampered with the hydraulic system. Someone who knew exactly how to make it look like mechanical failure. Hayes' throat went dry. Patricia Vance's death had been the final piece of the cover-up, eliminating the one person who could have connected Operation Black Viper to its true sponsors in the Pentagon. Hayes had assumed it was handled by the same shadowy figures who had ordered the mission in the first place. But now he wondered if he had been more directly involved than he remembered. I didn't kill Vance, he said, though even to his own ears the denial sounded weak. Maybe not personally, Maria agreed, but you provided the intelligence about her flight schedule, her security protocols, her maintenance crew. You made it possible for someone else to do the actual killing. Just like you've been doing for 15 years, enabling other people's crimes while keeping your own hands technically clean. The sound of footsteps approached across the parade ground, multiple sets moving with military precision. Hayes tried to crane his neck to see who was coming, but Maria kept him pinned in place with professional efficiency. "Ah, right on schedule," Maria said with satisfaction. "I'd like you to meet some friends of mine, Uncle Marcus. They've been very eager to have a conversation with you." 3 figures came into Hayes's limited field of vision, and his heart nearly stopped. The first was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the bearing of a career military officer. The second was a younger man with the lean build and watchful eyes of special operations. The third figure made Hayes's blood run cold. It was General Robert Hawthorne, the Pentagon official who had originally authorized Operation Black Viper. "Hello, Marcus," General Hawthorne said, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of buried secrets. "I think it's time we had a frank discussion about your extracurricular activities." Hayes felt the world spinning around him as he realized the true scope of Maria's operation. This wasn't just about revenge. For Miguel Rodriguez's death, it was about exposing the entire network of corruption and murder that had grown out of Operation Black Viper. Maria hadn't just been hunting individual unit members. She had been building a case that reached all the way to the Pentagon. "General Hawthorne," Hayes gasped, "I can explain everything. The operation was conducted according to your specifications." "My specifications?" Hawthorne's voice carried genuine surprise. "Marcus, I authorized the reconnaissance mission to gather intelligence on Taliban supply routes. I never authorized the massacre of civilians or the execution of your own unit members." Maria finally allowed Hayes to turn his head enough to see Hawthorne's face, and what he saw there made his stomach drop. The general wasn't here as a co-conspirator trying to cover up shared crimes. He was here as an investigator who had finally learned the truth about what had really happened in Afghanistan. "You see, Uncle Marcus," Maria said, her voice now carrying the satisfaction of a chess player announcing checkmate. "General Hawthorne has been very interested to learn how his limited reconnaissance authorization was transformed into a systematic campaign of war crimes and murder. He's particularly curious about the financial records I've uncovered showing payments from arms dealers to certain offshore accounts." Hayes closed his eyes, finally understanding that he had walked into a trap that had been 15 years in the making. Maria Santos hadn't just been hunting the members of Operation Black Viper, she had been building an airtight case that would expose everyone involved. From the foot soldiers who pulled the triggers to the Pentagon officials who had enabled the cover-up. The hunter had become the hunted, and there was nowhere left to run. General Hawthorne stepped closer, his weathered face a mask of controlled fury that Hayes had seen only once before, during a briefing about a friendly fire incident that had cost them an entire platoon. The general's presence here meant that Maria's investigation had reached the highest levels of military command, and Hayes realized with growing horror that his carefully constructed web of lies was about to collapse entirely. "Stand him up," Hawthorne ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect for over 3 decades. Maria hauled Hayes to his feet with surprising strength, keeping his service weapon trained on him while maintaining her grip on his twisted arm. The pain shooting through his shoulder was nothing compared to the terror clawing at his chest as he faced the man who could end his career with a single phone call. 15 years. "Marcus," Hawthorne said, his voice barely controlled. 15 years I've been wondering why that reconnaissance mission went so catastrophically wrong. 15 years of sleepless nights, wondering if I somehow failed those soldiers by sending them into a situation they weren't prepared for. Hayes tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. The woman with steel gray hair stepped forward, and Hayes recognized her with a shock that nearly buckled his knees. Colonel Janet Morrison, the sister of Lieutenant Morrison, one of the Black Viper unit members who had died in that car accident in Germany. "My brother called me 3 days before he died," Colonel Morrison said, her voice carrying the cold precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "He was scared, Marcus. He said someone was following him, that he'd received threatening phone calls warning him to keep quiet about Afghanistan. He wanted to know if he should contact the authorities." Hayes felt sweat pouring down his back despite the cool morning air. "Jed, I had nothing to do with your brother's death. It was an accident." "An accident?" Morrison's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her professional composure. "His brake lines were cut, Marcus. The German police found tool marks on the hydraulic system. Someone wanted my brother dead, and they made sure it looked like mechanical failure." The third figure, the lean man with special operations bearing, finally spoke. "Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, Army SID," he said, producing a badge and identification. "I've been investigating the deaths of Operation Black Viper personnel for the past 18 months. Ever since Miss Santos brought her evidence to our attention." Hayes felt the ground shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. Maria hadn't been working alone. She had been cooperating with Army Criminal Investigation Division, building a case that would stand up in military court. Every piece of evidence she had gathered, every recording she had made, had been done under official sanction. "This is impossible," Hayes said, his voice cracking with desperation. "Operation Black Viper is classified at the highest levels. SID doesn't have clearance to investigate." "We do now," Torres interrupted, producing a thick folder from his jacket. "Signed authorization from the Secretary of Defense himself, based on evidence of systematic war crimes and the murder of U.S. military personnel." "Your classification games are over, Colonel." Maria finally released Hayes' arm, but kept his weapon trained on him as she stepped back. "Tell them about the arms deals, Uncle Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had all the time in the world. "Tell them about the weapons you sold to Taliban commanders in exchange for safe passage through their territory." Hayes' mind raced through possible escape routes, but he was surrounded by trained military personnel on an active base. Even if he could somehow overpower Maria and reclaim his weapon, there was nowhere to run. The walls were closing in from every direction. "The arms deals were necessary for mission success," he said, falling back on the justification he had used to rationalize his actions for 15 years. "We needed intelligence on enemy positions, and sometimes that required making deals with local commanders." "Local commanders?" General Hawthorne's voice carried a note of incredulous rage. "Marcus, you sold American weapons to the same people who were killing American soldiers. You armed our enemies and then covered it up by murdering anyone who might expose your crimes." Torres opened his folder and began reading from what appeared to be a detailed timeline. June 15th, 2009. Operation Black Viper Unit discovers evidence of arms trafficking between U.S. personnel and Taliban forces. June 18th. Major Miguel Rodriguez files a formal complaint with his commanding officer. June 20th. Rodriguez is found dead, officially listed as killed in action during a Taliban ambush. Hayes felt his legs beginning to shake as Torres continued reading the chronology of his crimes. Each date, each name, each carefully documented murder was another nail in his coffin. July 2nd. Lieutenant Morrison begins asking questions about Rodriguez's death. July 8th. Morrison is transferred to Germany under suspicious circumstances. July 15th. Sergeant Baker requests a meeting with Army intelligence to discuss irregularities in mission reports. "Stop," Hayes whispered. But Torres continued relentlessly. August 3rd. Captain Williams attempts to contact a military journalist about potential war crimes. August 10th. Williams is reassigned to a remote posting in Alaska. September 1st. The remaining members of Operation Black Viper are systematically eliminated over the following 3 years. All deaths officially ruled as accidents or training incidents. Maria stepped closer, her dark eyes reflecting the morning sun like obsidian mirrors. 12 good soldiers, Uncle Marcus. 12 people who trusted you to lead them, to protect them, to bring them home safely. Instead, you murdered them to protect your criminal enterprise. Hayes finally snapped. The weight of 15 years of guilt, fear, and paranoia crashed down on him like an avalanche, and something fundamental broke inside his mind. With a roar of rage and desperation, he lunged toward Maria, hoping to reclaim his weapon and fight his way out of the trap that had been so carefully constructed around him. But Maria had been expecting this moment. She sidestepped his clumsy attack with fluid grace, using his own momentum to send him sprawling across the concrete. Before he could recover, Torres was on him. Professional restraints clicking around his wrists with the finality of a coffin lid closing. "Colonel Marcus Hayes," Torres said formally, "you are under arrest for the murders of 12 U.S. military personnel. Conspiracy to commit war crimes, arms trafficking, and treason. You have the right to remain silent." As Torres continued reading his rights, Hayes looked up at Maria with the desperate eyes of a drowning man. "Why?" he gasped. "Why go through all this elaborate charade? You could have just killed me like the others." Maria knelt beside him, her face showing no trace of the nervous recruit she had pretended to be just an hour earlier. "Because Miguel Rodriguez taught me that justice isn't just about punishment, Uncle Marcus. It's about truth. Those families deserve to know what really happened to their sons and daughters. They deserve to know that their loved ones died as heroes, trying to expose your crimes." General Hawthorne stepped forward, his face grim with the weight of command decisions that would reverberate through the Pentagon for years to come. "This investigation is going to tear through the military like a wildfire, Marcus. Every operation you were involved in, every order you gave, every person you worked with, all of it is going to be examined under a microscope." As military police vehicles surrounded the parade ground and Hayes was loaded into the back of an armored transport, Maria Santos stood watching with the satisfaction of someone who had spent 5 years planning this moment. The black viper tattoo on her wrist seemed to pulse with life in the morning sunlight, a permanent reminder that some ghosts refuse to stay buried, and that justice, however delayed, will eventually find its mark. The hunt was over. The reckoning had begun.